Hi everyone and welcome, and thank you for participating in today's webinar hosted by the National Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities, a project of Casa, Esperanza that builds bridges and connections among research, practice, and policy to advance effective responses to eliminate domestic violence and to promote healthy relationships within Latino families and communities. My name is Jose Juan Lara Jr., team member of the National Latina Network, and your host for today's webinar, Enhancing Cultural Responsiveness in the Courts webinar series in partnership with the Center for Court Innovation. This three-part webinar series will focus on enhancing access to justice by fostering more culturally responsive courts, court staff, and judges, identify role-specific responsibilities in implementing culturally responsive practices in the courts, assess culturally specific barriers survivors may face in the civil, family, and criminal justice systems, and design strategies for overcoming those challenges. Session 1, Impact of Violence at the Intersections of the Margins, will be a presentation of a personal experience of domestic and sexual violence and how poverty, language, culture, religious beliefs, and immigration all intertwine to complicate the few potential intervention points. Before we start, I want to review a few housekeeping details. Participants have been automatically placed on mute. As an extra precaution, we ask you also do the same on your listening devices just in case. If you are joining us using an agency phone and have hold music, please be aware it will be heard if you need to put the call on hold. If you have questions, please submit them in the Ask a Question box in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. We'll also be providing closed captioning. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the National Latina Network website. Any resources mentioned will be sent to participants, and you also receive an evaluation after the webinar. We ask that you kindly complete the evaluation since this also helps shaping future content for our webinars. If you'd like to register for the next webinars in the series, you may go to our website, www.nationallatinanetwork.org. With that, I'd like to welcome our presenter and my colleague, Olga Trujillo, who is the Director of Education and Advocacy at Casa Esperanza National Latina Network. Welcome, Olga.
Hi, Jose Juan. Thank you. All right. So, hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about my presentation before I get us started, just so everyone knows what to expect. Let's see. I think I have a slide that says this. Oh, yeah. So this is part of the Enhancing Cultural Responsiveness in the Courts training that we have done with our partners, UGMA and API GBV, and as well the Center for Court Innovation. This is a collaboration that is funded through the Department of Justice, where our organizations have developed a curriculum to help court staff and community-based organizations kind of explore how they can work together to enhance their access to their legal proceedings through cultural responsiveness. This first segment is one that, well, it'll help. It's based on my personal experience of violence. So what I'm going to do is through my story, I'm hoping to help connect more help you understand the connection between bias and oppression and its impact on a survivor's ability to access services. And I know a lot of us really already know that, so hopefully this will validate more about what you know, and maybe help you kind of talk about it in a different way. We're also going to look at how violence and oppression can result in trauma. And I'll do that through, I'm going to show you pictures of myself when I was growing up, and I'm going to tell you what was happening in our home, and I'm going to tell you what was happening outside of our home, and then what was happening in my head. And so the violence took place in my home. And so the unique piece to this presentation is that I'm going to show you how violence turns into trauma, and then how someone who experiences trauma can then respond differently because of the trauma. So I'll hopefully be able to identify signs of trauma and show you what they mean, and then hopefully help you develop strategies for becoming more culturally responsive and trauma-informed. So, and again, I'll use pictures as a way to guide us. So the reason that I feel, and this is like a huge passion of mine, that we need to know this is because the impact of violence is trauma. And the impact of oppression can leave people in dangerous situations without help. And I'll show you how that happened in our family. And all of this impacts how survivors think, talk, look when dealing with the violence. And then, and hopefully you'll see that incorporating cultural humility and a trauma-informed lens will enhance your responses and services. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to focus primarily on court responses because that's what we're focused on here. You can apply a lot of these trauma-informed suggestions to anything that you do. And there are some resources available for those of you around, like how to prepare survivors for legal proceedings, how to do trauma-informed legal advocacy. There's tip sheets and a handbook that have been produced through OVW funding, and I'll mention those along the way, and we can help you get copies of those if they're not already on our link. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to show you pictures of me when I was growing up, and I'm going to show you what was happening in our home and what was happening outside of our home, and then what was happening in my head. So just so you know, I'm not going to give you any graphic descriptions of violence. There are no pictures of violence. The pictures help me to remember and frame what was happening at the time. Okay, and so I'm going to go it takes me about 40 minutes to go through the story of what happened in our home. And then at that point, I'm going to stop and see if there are questions in the chat. So please feel free to write whatever questions you have as I'm presenting. We'll address some of those questions at that point, and then I'll connect my experience more to your work in the remaining part of the webinar. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So this is me. I am the youngest in my family. I have two older brothers. I was born in Washington, D.C. My brother, who's right next to me, was born in Venezuela. My brother, who's right next to him, was born in Cuba. My mom was from Puerto Rico, and my father was from Colombia. So, I know this is obvious, but I still have to tell you, that means we spoke Spanish at home. My father only spoke Spanish, understood English. My mom spoke English and Spanish, could read and write in English and Spanish, take shorthand in both languages, was pretty fluent, but had a strong Puerto Rican accent. At that time in the D.C. area, this was the 1960s, people weren't used to hearing someone speak English with a Puerto Rican accent. So my mom had a hard time going through her life in the D.C. area. Had a hard time grocery shopping, going to the department store, accessing any kind of services, because what would happen is that they would not only not be able to understand her, but then they would get frustrated, treat her less than they were. So they would be, they wouldn't take as much time to try to understand. They would get frustrated with her as if she was the problem. And eventually my mom stopped trying to access services. What I also saw as I was growing up with my mom was I could see how my mom was taking the things that people were saying and doing and internalizing them. So my mom grew up in Puerto Rico where she was middle class and the majority population. So she spoke Spanish. She got through whatever she needed. She went to college. She actually went to college when she was 16, graduated, and then continued on for 2 additional years because her father felt she was too young to start working. So my mom was smart, doing well, and then she met my father, they got married, and eventually they ended up in the D.C. area, Washington, D.C. area. At that point, my mom was no longer part of the majority population. My mom was now considered a minority who didn't speak the language properly. So I would see my mom's focus on how she felt like she was less than the people around her. And then she worked really hard to make sure that we weren't treated that way. And so what she did, though, was to tell us constantly to enunciate and to assimilate. So my mom started to internalize the ways in which people treated her into that's the proper way of being, and trying to make sure that we fit into that mold. And the more and more that she experienced that, the less and less she would engage with organizations or businesses outside of our home, and started to really, by the time that I'm 6 and 7 years old, I go everywhere with my mom, and I am my mom's interpreter, even though my mom speaks English. So these are kind of small ways in which my mom and I saw the impact of oppression growing up, and it probably doesn't sound like very much. But what my mom does here is she starts viewing our culture as not as good and trying to then get us to strip away the aspects of our culture and be very mainstream. My father has a different kind of reaction to all this, and he does take it to a level that, not many people would take it to. But my father tells people that he was a journalist with an El Salvadoran newspaper. My father tells people that he was a lawyer, or he'll tell people that he had a PhD in international relations. He tell people that he was an advisor to 2 presidents on Latin American affairs. And my father wasn't any of those things. My father understood English but didn't speak English, and because he wanted a certain level of respect, he wouldn't apply for jobs that he could get in the D.C. area, which were mostly, labor, service type jobs. He would periodically work, and then once people realized he didn't have the skills that he said he had, he'd get fired. So my mom was primarily the person that supported us. My father would take the money that my mom made and oftentimes didn't pay the rent or didn't have enough money for groceries because my father was buying suits, expensive suits that he would wear and walk around in the neighborhood. Again, these are kind of extreme responses to feeling less than other people, but it for sure plays out in this really weird dynamic in our home. So here I'm 3 years old, and at 3 years old I look like a really happy kid, and so what's happening in our home at this point I think is normal. So what I'm seeing and being drawn into as a pattern of behavior by my father that again I think is really normal. So first, it starts with intermittent violence. At any point in time, my father will strike one of us in our family, and so when he strikes me, I want to know what happened, like why he hit me. And he lets me know that there was something that I did that made him have to hit me. So he blames me for his use of violence against me. And what he tells me is that I disrespected him. And at 3 years old, I don't know what that means. All I know about respect at 3 years old is that I'm supposed to have it for my parents, which I later realized that he means him. That above my parents, I'm supposed to respect elders in our community. And above the elders in our community, I'm supposed to respect those closest to God. And I'm being raised Catholic at home, so the way I interpret that is that those closest to God are the priests and nuns at our church and school. So that's all I know about respect. Well, so what I do, because my father's hitting me and because I believe him when he tells me it's my fault, I start to watch my father really, really carefully. And in watching my father, I'm searching his eyes. I'm listening to what he says and how he says it. I'm watching the way he moves through a room, what his body mannerisms are. I want to know. I'm trying to predict what it is that I'm doing so that I can stop it. So if I see what he looks like just before he hits me, I might be able to change my behavior to prevent him from hitting me. So what this does is it strengthens the bond and the attachment that I have to my father. And it's not something based in love, but actually based in fear. And because I'm spending so much time focusing on him, it also weakens the bonds that I have with my mom and with my brothers. So my relationship to my father is stronger than any others in my home. My father starts then, he'll throw something, he'll yell, he'll slam something down at a table, he'll move quickly through a room. And this will happen just kind of, in my opinion, it felt like just out of nowhere. And those behaviors reminded me that my father would hit me. And so whatever I was doing at that moment, I would stop doing and try to be, try to behave, be quiet, be still. Because I'm reminded that my father will hit me, and so that's changing my behavior again. And so this is clearly intimidation. And this is how someone like my father can use intermittent violence, even once, will use violence, and that'll affect how I respond to the other things that he did, because I know he's capable of using violence. My father also engages me and my brothers in humiliating jokes about my mom. My father makes fun of the way she sounds when she speaks English, knowing that that's something that she feels insecure about. My father, once my mom cleans the house, my father takes her from room to room and shows her all the things that she did wrong and makes her clean the house again. My mom will make something for dinner, and my father will taste it, and if he doesn't like it, he'll throw it out, and we might not have anything else to eat that night, and my father will blame my mother for that. So these are all things that eroded the relationship that we had with my mom. My father didn't treat my mom with respect, so then my brothers started to not treat my mom with respect. My father would also punish me and punish my brothers if we asked my mom if we could do something, and she said it was okay, and then we did it. We would be punished because we didn't ask him. So in this way, he was also undermining my mom's authority over us. And it didn't take us very long to figure out that we needed to ask him. At this age, I've seen my father rape my mom at least 6 times. And in one of those times, I tried to stop my father from raping my mom. At that point, what I'm going to do is gently walk you through what happens. I'm going to show you the inside out, the trauma response to it. So when I tried to stop my father from raping my mom, my father raped me. And again, I'm not going to give you any graphic descriptions, but let me show you what happened in my head. So when my father turned around and I realized that he was going to hurt me, I started to hit him, and within a second he overpowered me, and then I felt a tremendous sense of panic. And within seconds, I didn't feel that sense of panic anymore. I felt numb. And I didn't really even feel like I was in my body anymore. I felt like I was up in the ceiling in the corner. And my father was raping me, and I'm not feeling the extent of the pain, and I'm not feeling any emotion at all. And so when my father's done, he leaves the room, my mom leaves the room, and I clean up that room, and then I go to the bathroom and I clean myself off, and then I go to my room and crawl under my bed. And when I crawl under my bed, I fall asleep. The next morning, I wake up in my bed, and I don't remember what happened the night before. So let me walk through that coping mechanism. So that out-of-body experience is called dissociation. And that's a pretty significant dissociative reaction there. So it's not just that I was outside my body, but that I was so outside my body and so numb. And the fact that I dissociated so deeply that in the morning I don't remember what happened the night before, that's a pretty sophisticated coping mechanism at that point. So that says to me that's not the first time that I was abused by my father, but it is my first memory of abuse. So let me just kind of pull apart the issue of dissociation, because I think this is a really important thing for us all to know. Oftentimes when people talk about trauma, they talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's a really significant disorder, and it's really important to know about it. But there's one element in all trauma, whether it's post-traumatic stress disorder or any other kind of post-traumatic stress or comprehensive trauma, that anytime someone experiences something physically threatening or emotionally overwhelming, if they get through it, they will have dissociated. And that's my most profound experience, is the dissociation. So I want to kind of get into it and pull it apart a bit. So when I was raped and I left my body cognitively and was in the ceiling, I pulled the experience of being raped by my father apart. So I pull out the physical pain, and I pull that away from the emotional reaction to what my father's doing. And then I pull that away from the awareness that my father did this and will do this to me. And then it just kind of gets parked in my brain. And so it doesn't feel like something that happened to me because I left my body cognitively. So then so when I'm reminded of that experience, and I don't mean a conscious reminder, I mean a traumatic reminder, a trigger. So when something matches that incident, then I'll re-experience the pain and the emotion, and I'll have this vague awareness that something happened to me. I'll re-experience it as if it's happening right then, as opposed to remembering that's something that happened to me when I was 3. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. Let me restate it a little bit. So when you experience something traumatic and you get through it and you survive, you dissociate. And when you dissociate, though, you don't always integrate that dissociated experience. So it sits in your mind a little bit like when you're on a computer screen. So when you're on the computer and you're on a website and you want to be able to come back to this website, you'll bookmark it. And so then it might be weeks later, months later, you tap that bookmark and you're right back at that page. Well, the dissociation works a little bit like that. It takes that experience and it pulls it apart and it sits somewhere in my mind. And then when there's something that reminds me of it, and the reminder is going to come through my senses. So it might be the cologne that my father wore. It might be the feeling of being trapped. It might be seeing someone that looks like my father, having someone stand too close to me that feels threatening. It could be any of those kinds of things, going into a room that looked like that room. Then what'll happen is that creates a trigger or a traumatic reminder that then I re-experience the panic that I felt just before I dissociated and the physical pain of the rape. And so and that's in large part because I dissociated through it. But the dissociation saves me because if I knew that next morning when I woke up that my father would do that to me, I think I would have killed myself. Maybe not that day, but years down the road. So this is a really powerful coping mechanism that enables someone like me to be able to look happy and to function in the world despite this level of violence that's happening in our home. So as you'll see, as I go through these pictures, you're going to see a stare that starts to kind of show up in my pictures, and that stare is because of dissociation, because it not only helps me get through the traumatic incidents, but then over time, our home is so violent and so chaotic that it helps me be in our home and not feel that level of chaos and fear. So I'm in second grade here, and before I go to what's happening in my world in second grade, let me close up a little bit on the trauma piece. So ultimately, when I start to talk about what happened to me when I was a kid, so after that rape, because of the way I coped, when I talk about the experience, I'm going to talk about it with a really, really flat manner. And you're gonna think to yourself that what I'm saying and how I'm saying it does not match up at all. And it'll be kind of a little freaky or eerie, or it sounds like I'm making it up. And that's really, really normal for something that's traumatic, for someone who's gotten through something traumatic. Because in order to surviving it, right, we're going to dissociate. And if we dissociate, it doesn't feel like it happened to us. So then when we talk about it, it doesn't feel like it happened to us. So as survivors, we're likely to have that really flat tone and flat manner, and we're likely to have a spacey look, a stare at the time that we're talking about it. And again, that's the dissociation because in the telling, you'll see the sign of dissociation. And then you'll likely hear someone talking in a very, very scattered manner. And that's because when we experience a certain amount of stress, there are chemicals that are released in our brains that hamper the prefrontal cortex. And that prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that takes all the things that are coming into your brain and it kind of incorporates higher level thinking. So it creates a linear logical collection of what's happening. So when I'm raped that night, that's incredibly stressful. And so those chemicals are hampering my prefrontal cortex. So I'm collecting things through my senses. I'm collecting smells and tastes and feelings, what I'm touching, what I'm staring at, anything that I'm collecting through my senses is coming in to my brain and being encoded, but not encoded in a logical linear manner. So when I first start talking about it without some help, I'm going to talk about it in a very scattered manner. And those three signs are really clear signs of trauma. When you have someone who's talking to you about something that happened to them in that manner with a stare, in this really flat tone, that says to you that this person has experienced trauma, and then you want to kind of go behind what it is. So instead of kind of thinking to yourself, what's wrong with this person, it's the question is going to be now, what happened to this person? So, and this is really important because the way we talk about the things that happen to us affect credibility. And if you know these things about trauma, then you're going to adapt your lens. When you see trauma, you're going to adapt your lens and you're going to think, okay, so these ways of talking are normal for trauma. So then that should be something where it's like, okay, so then I've got to figure out what happened to this person that they've experienced this much trauma. Okay, so, and you can do this throughout your programs and in particular throughout your courts, having people trained in this, having people have patience and having people know what their language access plan is, making sure that the court is accessible for people, for people who are deaf, for people with disabilities, like make it as easy as possible to get into and access the legal system, and then incorporate this lens so that we're believing people who have these signs of trauma, or at least exploring what it is that's behind it. So by the time, and this is really important because at this age, when I'm in second grade, I'm being sexually abused on a regular basis. My father is sexually abusing me at night. My father is also sexually abusing me when I come home from school, if he's the only one home. And by this point, too, the violence in our home is escalating. And I think the violence in our home is escalating because my brothers and I are in school, my mom is working, and my father is still kind of in this same place of not being able to find work or not being able to keep work very often. So our lives are expanding, and we're all in the world speaking English, making friends, and my father doesn't speak English and isn't really out in the world. So I think he was feeling like he was losing control over us, and so then his violence would escalate. There's also things that are happening at our school. So for example, my brother's name is Enrique. My oldest brother's name is Enrique, and the kids at school were bullying him quite a bit. And the nuns suggest to my mom that they might not bully my brother as much if we anglicize his name. So my mom agrees, and from that point on, my brother Enrique has become my brother Henry. And my father is furious about this and takes it out on my brother. So any time that he sees a report card, a school assignment with the name Henry on there, he beats up my brother, and he blames my brother for this. So again, kind of how the ways in which we're treated badly because we're different, how that's coming into our home, and creating more tension and becoming part of my father's abuse. So at this age, I learn about the police, and what I learn is that, I have an officer-friendly class in school, and what I learn is that if we're in trouble, we can call the police and they'll come and help. So a few weeks after that class, my father was perpetrating an attack against my mom in the kitchen where he had one of the knives in his hand. And I was afraid that my father was going to kill my mom. And so I ran to the phone and dialed the number that they told us in school and yelled into the phone that my father was killing my mom. I gave them the information that they needed, and my father came and hung up the phone. And he waited with me for the police to come. When the police arrived, so what you need to know is this is 1968, and there's no Violence Against Women Act, and at this point I'm not sure what child abuse laws are on the books, but we don't know about them. And so when the police arrive, my brothers are upstairs hiding, and my mom comes to the front door. My father and I are there. They can't understand my mom. They can't communicate with my father. And so they ask me to tell them what happened, and they want me to interpret for my mother and father. So I'm too scared to do that. And there's several reasons why I'm too scared to do that. One is because I know my father's furious at me, but I'm not surprised about that. What I'm more surprised about and what I'm scared about is that my mom is really, really angry with me that I called the police. And I thought she would be really happy that I called the police, that this is, they're supposed to help us. So I don't tell the police what happened in our home that night. What I do is I tell them that I learned about them in school and that I called just to see if they would come. So I think it was obvious to the officers that showed up at our home that something had happened that night. And but they didn't feel that they could do anything about it. And right before they left, one of the officers got down on his knee and was making eye contact with me, very gently said to me, the police are for emergencies. And so when there's an emergency, you call the police. So what I got from that, between what he said and the gentleness of his manner, was that I can call the police again, and that's okay. And so I would have. When they left, my father went and got one of our 3 dogs, brought him to me, and then killed him in front of me. And so in that moment, I learned what my mom knew, which was that my father was really, really dangerous, and that my father would kill us, would kill anything we loved, if we told people what was happening in our home, and if I didn't do what he wanted me to do. So at that point, I never called the police again. So this is a really important intervention point. So today, we don't want to lose those opportunities. So making sure that we understand the different cultures in our communities, that we can communicate with them, and that if we can't communicate with them, that we have access to people that can help them. And using kids, obviously, is never the right thing to do. I mean, one, you're not really getting reliable information that you can use down the road when you're using kids. And then also you're putting them at higher risk, and it's even more traumatizing for them. So what ends up happening in our home is after that, my father then starts to engage my brothers in my sexual abuse. And so the abuse in our home gets even more chaotic. And so I'm now 8 years old, and you can see here in this picture, I have more of a stare, and I have dark circles and bags under my eyes, and this is really common for me growing up. And it makes sense when you think my father's sexually abusing me at night, and it makes sense when you think that, it would be hard for me to sleep. So I have bags and dark circles under my eyes most of the time, and I have this stare. So this stare is a dissociative stare, and it's because there's so much chaos in my home, the abuse has changed so dramatically that that to get through the days at home, I dissociate. So it's so chaotic that I dissociate. So let me just kind of walk you through just so you can get a sense of what that feels like. So many people will have an experience of driving somewhere, and when they get there, they'll realize that they weren't paying attention when they were driving. Or some people in reading a book will get so lost in the book that they won't be noticing what's going on around them. They get totally captured by the book. And then when they're done, or when they're done for that day, they're surprised what time of day it is, where they are, that kind of thing. Same thing, some people get that way when they go to a movie. They come completely captured by the movie that they lose track of everything else around them. So that's normal dissociation, and everybody does that. So what I'm doing is about 100 times that. So I get up in the morning, and I get out of bed because I feel immediately anxious. And then I get up and I start to get dressed, and I start to dissociate because the level of anxiety is just too much for me. And so when I'm getting dressed and I look in the mirror, I don't connect that my hair is messy, or in this picture that those bows aren't tied right. Like, I go to school looking like this is my class picture from my school that year, and I'm not a messy kid. As a kid, I'm really tidy. But because I'm dissociating, so if you think about yourself driving in the car and not paying attention to the drive, you can tell that feeling is the feeling that I would have. So when I look in the mirror, I don't see that my hair is messy or that those bows aren't tied right, and I don't fix it. I'm just going through the motions of getting ready to go to school. And that's in large part because now the abuse is more chaotic. So you're going to look for a stare in people, and that stare is going to be one of the 3 signs that will tell you that this person has been experiencing trauma, or that your work with them is traumatic for them, because in large part because of what happened to them, that they're in there with you, that brings up the reason why that you're working with them. So here's the stare here. Now I think the stare is much more profound. And then, can you see the stare in that one? So this stare is my normal. So what happens is that when I'm 11 years old, my father has a massive coronary and dies. And about 6 months after that, my mom's working full time, and my brothers and I are home after school for the summer. And my brothers start perpetrating rapes and gang rapes against me. And they do this because my father, in engaging them in my sexual abuse, have basically taught them that they can do this to me. I will act as though it didn't happen, and I won't tell anyone. And I might even make it easier for them, because what happens over time when you're being abused is you start to learn, and this is all instinctive, not conscious. But initially, when my father first sexually abused me, I fought back, and over time I stopped fighting back, but I still resist him. And then over time I stopped resisting, and then eventually, by the time that I'm 7 years old, I initiate the abuse when I'm triggered. So when I talked about being 7 years old and being, and if I were the only one home with my father after school, that he would abuse me, when I come home from school, at the point in time that I realize that my father is the only one home, I'm triggered because that's a match for another time that I was abused by my father. And so what I feel when I'm triggered is that panic. And it's the panic that I felt just before I dissociated when I was 3. And then I would feel the pain of that rape. So that trigger, it's the replay of that rape. So what I want to do is I want to stop that pain and panic. And so what I realized is that the last time this came up, I went and initiated the abuse with my father. So at that point in time, that's what pops into my mind, and that's what I go do. And so just to be really, really clear, I wasn't consciously trying to get the abuse over with, and I was just merely trying to stop the panic, and this is what popped into my head as to how I do that. So what my brothers learn over time when they're brought into my abuse is that I will act as though it didn't happen and I won't tell anyone. And then eventually I might make it easier. And what that means is that I might get triggered when my brother and their friends are in a situation with me that matches the previous gang rape. And then I might initiate the abuse. And so that's why I have this bigger stare. And it's really important to notice this again, because what happens is that this is the stare that I have as I'm moving through my world. So when I'm in public, if it's chaotic, my stare deepens. And so when I'm on the bus system from going from my high school to the Boys and Girls Club, a guy gets on the bus and sees the stare. He eventually sees me and sees this stare and comes over to me and stands inappropriately close to me. And in standing inappropriately close to me, in my mind, I'm thinking, creepy, 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 get away, and no, no, no. But what I do is I don't move away. I don't say anything to him. I don't get off the bus. I dissociate more. So my coping mechanism is pretty established, and my stare deepens, and this guy notices it. And then he tests it. So the standing really close to me is testing to see how I'm going to respond. And then he starts asking me what my name is. And even though I'm hearing in my head, no, 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 I tell him my name because that is how I cope. That is how I learned that I survive. I comply. Okay, so I'm not sure if that makes sense to a lot of people, but I want to connect how it is that people will instinctively know to comply when they're in danger, even though someone else might not think that what they experienced was something dangerous. Okay, so this is a lot of stuff, and it's a lot of really hard stuff. I had amazing people come into my life and help me, from the next door neighbor that I had when I was 3 years old, who I would spend my days with every day for 2 years, who was enormously generous and kind and gentle, to a woman that ran the community center near our home, to teachers and coaches. I mean, clearly I had good people in my life that enabled me to survive better than people would expect, given the level of violence that I experienced. So I want to stop there for a second and just kind of see how people, like if people have questions, just kind of check in. So Jose Juan, I'm not seeing very much in the chat. Is that
yeah,
that
people are starting to type. So again, just a reminder, folks, please type in your questions in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner. So people are typing.
Okay.
Okay, so a question, Olga. Is it appropriate to ask if you are ever asked what happened to your father?
Oh, yeah. So that my father had a massive coronary and died when I was 11 years old. Um, so I'm not sure if that's the question that you're asking. Does that sound like what she's asking, Jose Juan? What happened?
I think
Or is
so.
it why? Like what happened to my father to make him be the way he is or was?
Yeah, so yeah. I'm assuming, yeah. So, Ruby, if you want to, if that's your question, please type yes or no. But that's what my understanding is of the question. People are still typing.
Okay. So one of the things I'll just kind of emphasize. Oh, okay. So wait, I'll go ahead.
Okay, so
You have another one.
yes. So from Lupita, what were some of the tools you used to heal from your trauma? In other words, what was most helpful to you? I think that's a very important question, especially when you're dealing with a survivor who may be testifying in court. So I think that's also important.
Right.
So what were some of the tools you used to help you heal from your trauma, Olga?
Yeah. So what I did first. So I pretty much tried to get away from my family as best I could, and and it wasn't so much like physically away from my family because again I'm not consciously aware that these things are happening to me, but I want to get away from the poverty that I grew up in because what I did remember was being poor growing up and how hard that was. So I go to college and then after college, I get a job on Capitol Hill, and then I go to law school. And at the time that I start to deal with all the stuff that happened to me, I was the general counsel of the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. And I was 31 years old. And then I started having a series of panic attacks that I came to find was related to all this stuff that had happened to me as a kid that I did not remember happening. And so I went through a process of healing that involved psychosocial therapy, which is talk therapy, and body work. It's kind of this holistic kind of healing to heal, to remember what happened and bring back all those pieces and create to be able to see the picture of what happened in a linear, logical way. And then also to heal my body. So it took a really kind of a long time to go through that. All along, I'm working and I'm married and I have friends and, so it's just, as my life is continuing, I'm filling in all the stuff that happened. And so what I think, and I kind of wanted to give that as a piece of information of context, because what I think is really helpful for people is for people to if people aren't in crisis and they're doing okay, is for people to make choices about what they want to do in terms of their own healing. But the ways in which we can help them get through something that's happening in their life now is to develop kind of meaningful connections with them. So meaningful connections would be like my next door neighbor connecting with me over things that were real to the two of us, and building my resilience. So not her making up something that she enjoyed, but her sharing with me who she was and seeing how that matched, and for her to connect with me in that way. For the woman, like the woman at the community center where I went, taught me how to tell time because my parents gave me a watch one year and I didn't know how to tell time. And so that was a way for her to connect with me that was really meaningful. So one is that meaningful connections. Two is to make things as predictable as possible for people who are coming through the legal system in particular, because the legal system can be, the adversarial nature can be so triggering. And I have a tip sheet that the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health put out that I actually wrote about how you can help survivors in legal, prepare for legal proceedings. Also, when you're working with people, looking for the signs of trauma and then connecting with it, so when you see those signs of trauma, then one, it's going to change the way that you determine credibility, but also it often means that you need to take more time with people, not rush through, because some trauma oftentimes slows our, when I get triggered, for example, my processing is slower than at other times when I'm not triggered. So people who've experienced trauma, it might be a little harder to understand things that I'm given to read. It might take me a little bit longer to connect all the thoughts. So having a little bit more time for people helps. And then identifying who is their support people that can come with them when they're doing something like, going and participating in a legal proceeding, or reporting a crime, or, applying for a job, or whatever it might be that might be hard for them. Sorry, that's a really long answer. Hope that one.
No, but I think it's important because I think having worked with survivors as an advocate, often when you provide survivors with a lot of options, or taking a survivor to meet a lawyer to represent them in a divorce, there's the domestic violence issues, a lot of times you'll ask the survivor, did you understand? And they'll say yes. And then I know as an advocate that probably may not be accurate, so we come back to the office and then say, okay, let's break it down. And I think you also touched another important point around survivors' trust and support. And often when that interaction happens is they'll say, I didn't understand. I said, okay, that's fine. So let's talk about it. So I think a lot of times, like you said, because of the trauma, sometimes we use jargon a lot of times in the work that we do, instead of accounting for the trauma that may help impede some of this understanding process. But some other questions, some people, a lot of us who do this work are survivors. Do you have any tools to continue to practice self-care or to deal with triggers that may come from dealing with client stories?
Yeah, wow. So that's a kind of a really big one. So I always try to be really mindful of and really observant of what am I thinking and how am I feeling. I spent most of my life dissociating from my body, like being so disconnected from it, not paying attention to what was happening and just doing whatever was happening in front of me, just kind of reacting to things. And some of those things felt really unsafe, but because I wasn't paying attention to my thoughts or paying attention to how I felt, I just did them anyway. So I don't do that anymore, and that's really, really important, is to recognize kind of where your limits are and to honor them. It doesn't mean that not to gently grow and push yourself, but recognize kind of what things are things that you just, can't do or may need a little bit of work to be able to do. So I'll give you an example. I'm never going to go to a football game, like to a stadium, and be around a bunch of men yelling and screaming and smelling like alcohol. It's just not going to work for me. I did that once, had a panic attack. I totally got it much later when I started doing a lot of the healing, why that wasn't going to work for me. And I'm okay with that. Things that I wasn't okay with was I have, difficulty flying because sometimes that can feel trapped. And so I work really, really hard to be able to fly. So there are certain things that I put in place in my life. I give myself plenty of time before I get there. I try to make sure I'm in a seat on the plane that feels, fairly comfortable. I try to fly the same airline so I know what to expect because, like I said, predictability really helps. So those are things, is to kind of pay attention and take care of yourself. as you move through your life. And then I limit how much I hear from survivors. So when I'm involved in work directly with survivors, either through focus groups and stuff, I try to structure it so we're talking about someone's experience with a system as opposed to someone's experience of violence. And I try hard not to be exposed to too much graphic descriptions of violence. I find that really hard because it totally triggers me. Okay, long answer again.
No, that's great. Of course, I mean, I've heard you share the story before, and every time it's I learn something new. But there's always questions from the participants as to, what happened relationship between you and your parents. So one of the questions is, and if you don't mind answering, did you ever speak with your mother, and why she reacted the way she did throughout your experience of the abuse or violence?
Yeah, so it wasn't until I was 31 that I started to remember what had happened. Up until that point, I had, I had regular contact with my mom and with my brothers. And after I started, once I started to remember, I started with panic attacks, and I instinctively cut off communication with my family. And so in the process of dealing with the panic attacks, I started to remember some of the things that happened. And so when I finally went back to my mom and let her know what I was starting to remember, my mom very, very matter-of-factly said to me, so I told her two things. I told her that I was remembering some stuff that my father did to me, and then I remembered that my oldest brother raped me. And my mom, didn't miss a beat. I mean, in a really flat tone said to me, oh, I'm not surprised. And she told me that my father was really hard on us. And then she said, oh, and then your brother, he was arrested when he was 16 for raping a girl in the neighborhood. I mean, in this really flat tone, and so at that point, I knew what I was hearing was trauma. So that made me think my mom probably coped in a similar manner. But the difficulty in this is that I was getting help for the trauma that I had experienced, from the violence that I experienced, and that I could only make that decision for myself. And as I started to tell my mom and my brothers more about what I was remembering, they started getting really anxious about it and started telling me to snap out of it. That was a long time ago. Forget about it. And I couldn't, there was no turning back once that all started coming up for me. So I knew at that point that if they didn't get help, I wasn't going to be able to have a relationship with them, because I can't do all this work and then have them not do any of the work and be able to relate with them. So I wrote them letters and asked them, explain the process that I was going through, and gave them books to read and names and numbers of therapists, and basically asked them to support me in this process, and let them know that if they didn't, I didn't think I could continue having a relationship with them. And so what happened is they stopped calling me after they received those letters, and they never responded to the letters. I just didn't hear from them again. And so I had no contact I have had little to no contact with my brothers since 1993. I had intermittent contact with my mom in 2007 and again in 2012, and my mom just recently passed away. So that's probably my mom, and having a relationship with her was probably my biggest loss in the terms of but I knew I couldn't do it. I tried a couple times to do it, and at this point when you have this mental health situation that you feel you're on the edge of sanity, you're going to be really protective of that stable kind of well-being. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yes. So along those same lines, Olga, one of the questions here is, what do you do when you get triggered now as an adult? And I think this is a very important question, especially when we're perhaps advocating with adult survivors who may have repressed or suppressed the memory, and they come to the crisis center for counseling, and then depending on the state that they live in, whether the statute of limitations have expired or not around prosecuting on the crime, what can we do, or what can we expect to help an adult survivor who may have suppressed some of these memories, but now decide, I'm getting the counseling, I feel strong, and if they decide to go to the justice system, how can we as advocates kind of help perhaps minimize, if that's the question or the right term?
Yeah. So there's a couple things there, Jose Juan. One is, so just as an adult now, I've done so much work that when I get triggered, it's barely a blip. Which means that when I used to get triggered, it would destabilize me, meaning that I would feel really off, and it would be sometimes hard to figure out. I would feel pain. So basically, I would feel the pain and the panic of the rapes, and I wouldn't know why I was feeling that sense of panic or pain. I wouldn't always connect it to something that triggered me. So it used to take me a really long time to work out of it. And now it's like a blip. I can usually anticipate the trigger. Oftentimes I'll know, oh shoot, that was triggering for me. And so there's I think well, the way I describe this is I have this little superpower now where I can kind of step outside of the trigger and notice that I'm triggered, and then ground myself. So get myself to recognize where I am, what year it is, bring myself back to today rather than into the past when I was hurt. And so that comes with a lot of work, but that's one of the things that we can help survivors with when we're working with them, whether you're in the courthouse, whether you're in advocacy at an organization, learning how someone might feel when they're triggered and how you can help ground them is really, really important. Learning about trauma and having information for survivors is also really important, just general information that survivors can then learn, because you don't know that this is normal for violence, for having experienced violence. You think that there's something wrong with you. And so having kind of basic information about this is really, really helpful. And then also, if you come in, so let me give you an example, okay? And this little story might not seem relevant, but I'm going to tie it right back in. So if we could create a system response that takes someone and says, hey, I know that you've been through a lot of stuff, and this is going to be hard for you, and we're going to try to make this as easy as possible for you, and here's what we're going to help you do. Okay, so that might not make much sense, but let me give you an example. Last week, I got on a plane that was smaller than I expected to go out of town, and before the plane door closed, I could tell that I was going to have a panic attack. So I got up, got my stuff, went to the flight attendant and told her, I don't think I can go on this flight. I can tell I'm going to have a panic attack. That flight attendant walked me out to the gate, connected me with their manager for that area, and said, she's about to have a panic attack. She's not going to be able to fly. Can you rebook her? I mean, she gently handled me to this other person, and then the process of walking together, she says, I have claustrophobia too, and it took me years to figure it out. And it's not your fault. It's, everybody, we see this, and don't worry about it. We'll get you on a bigger plane. And then the manager in that area came, they worked with me, they got me on another plane, they talked to me about strategies, they gave me ideas for how I do this in the future. It was amazing. If we could create that kind of situation in our advocacy organizations, in our courts, in our system responses, wouldn't that just be amazing? Then people who experience sexual violence who have trauma, or people who've experienced domestic violence, they don't feel bad about themselves. I felt really bad about myself last week, and then both the flight attendant and the manager said, oh yeah, we've had claustrophobia too. This happens. It's not unusual. Our planes are getting smaller and smaller. Like if we could do that for people, it would make it so much easier to participate in the system and so much easier to accept the what we're left with, which are like a lot of the symptoms of trauma. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where I want us to go. And I wonder, Jose Juan, if I shouldn't turn back to the slides, unless you think there's another question here, because it kind of dovetails what I just said, like how do we get there?
Yeah, no, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so if we want to create something like that, if we want to have a response for people that kind of lets them know, like, we get this and we know this is hard and this is not their fault that it's hard, that'll help us prevent re-traumatization. And it's really hard to do that in our legal systems. I'm just going to say, because it's an adversarial system, it is inherently triggering. But if you prioritize safety, then, and when I say prioritizing safety, I mean physical safety for sure, like so safety from the batterer, safety from the abuser, but then also emotional safety. So having a place that's welcoming, helping people to know that this isn't their fault, that this is normal, like giving them information. And again, there's tip sheets on these that the National Center for Trauma, Mental Health, and Substance Abuse, that they have. And then again, we have a couple of those tip sheet and a handbook that could also be useful in your thought process. But so prioritizing that safety and then recognizing the impact. So it took me a really long time to recognize all the ways in which trauma impacts my life. It affects my energy. It affects whether I feel like I can do something or not. It affects my enjoyment of things. And so being able to let people know that that's normal for trauma, that's normal for violence, really kind of helps people not feel so bad about it. And then, again, I think there should be accessibility. Like, if you're trying to be trauma-informed, you can't be trauma-informed if you can't communicate with the people that you're working with, or if you're not learning more about cultures from those cultures. Like if you have bilingual, bicultural advocates, they're more likely to understand the cultures that they're working with, that they live in, than someone outside that culture. And let me give you just a simple example. Latinos, for the most part, as a culture, we're collectivist. We're a little bit like the beehive. Like, we all work together in a family. And, for the benefit of that family, we're not individualistic. But if people approach us in an individualistic way, it won't resonate for us. Now, I'm very, very different from that because of the abuse that I suffered from my family of origin, that I am more individualistic. So knowing the collectivist aspects of a culture will really help a program determine how to approach. So if you only go individualistic all the time, you're going to lose people. Your program isn't going to seem relevant to them. And that kind of stuff happens when like shelters, for example, can't house survivors and their older children. In Latino culture, we're not likely to leave our kids behind. So those are some of the ways in which kind of being more accessible is important. And I don't just mean language accessibility, but engaging communities, hiring people who are bicultural, bilingual, will help programs be able to be more informed about how they work with particular communities. And then engaging communities, there's a tremendous amount of things that we can all do to know who's in our community, who those community-based programs are that serve in those areas, and invite them to the table and invite them to kind of be part of our responses. So how do you do this? How do you become more trauma-informed and more culturally responsive? So one is you need to have as much flexibility for survivors as possible. Like I said, people who experience trauma might need a little bit more time because processing things can be a little harder. Giving people things in different modes of learning, so videos are good. What we call fotonovelas are helpful for people to see kind of a process. Talking to people, walking people through things, and giving people things in writing. But not just giving people things in writing, because sometimes the trauma can make it hard for people to comprehend what they're reading. And then also, if you're not explaining things and taking your time with people and just giving things in writing, then they're not likely to completely understand what your service is, or what your process is, or what your system is. And you can create trauma and culturally welcoming environments. This is really important right now. It's not enough to be silent around all the anti-immigrant and anti-gay issues that are going on. It's that you almost have to have signs and be in meetings where you're letting people know that folks are welcome here, that we're not silent, because silence right now would feel like acquiescing or agreement. And then, again, developing connections with community-based organizations. In the training that we do for court staff, we try to spend a good amount of time trying to identify what other programs are in their community that they could reach out to or work with. Do they know what services they provide? They're really, really important, and oftentimes are the ones that are working with families like mine. So bringing them into the work that you do can really help for those families to be able to access your services or your system. I feel like I'm saying a whole lot really fast. Okay. So a couple other things. Remember, like I said, legal proceedings are inherently triggering, and that's because of their adversarial nature. So some things to kind of look for is to see if it's possible to use video testimony. Sometimes the level of trauma would make it too difficult for the survivor to be able to testify in the same room as the defendant or respondent. So then trying to identify ways like to get accommodations for them. Exploring video testimony is one of those ways. The thing, just as a cautionary note, if you use something like you're trying to use the Americans with Disabilities Act to try to get an accommodation for people to participate in the legal system. One, it's not really firmly established that you can do that. But if you do, and if the court allows you to, then you have to say what it is that that person is struggling with. Okay, so that requires a diagnosis to do that. Okay, so that's one piece, but then that diagnosis stays with that person. So maybe it'll help them get video testimony, but it might mean that they get fired, or it might mean that they lose their kids, or on and on and on. So, so I say this because I want you to, as you think about these ways that enable people to participate in the legal system, that you also look at unintended consequences. So always plan to have more time for people who've experienced violence that you're working with in the legal system. Prepare early and make it as predictable as possible. What I always recommend is that, if you have somebody who's testifying, let's say someone who's testifying in a criminal court, to have them, like work with them to come to the court, sit in on that judge's court, walk through where they would walk through, where they're going to meet someone. This is the elevator they're going to take. Do all that before they actually go to court, so that it makes it just a little bit easier. Otherwise, you may have someone who panics, who you then have to try to figure out how to get there. And I've heard quite a bit from victim witness people that end up driving to that victim's home to try to get them to come. And that's a really painful experience. So in accessing services, again, you want to plan ahead. Predictability is your key to success. A couple other things is limit stimulation. Limiting noise and chaos, keeping things orderly and structured really helps. And like I said earlier, use different modes of communication to try to convey things in a way that people will be able to understand and remember. And talk internally about trauma-related issues and how you'll handle them. So talk as you're preparing for these cases about trauma, the signs that you're seeing in someone, and how you'll handle them. And I want to point out a tool that might be helpful. So I co-wrote with 2 other attorneys a handbook for lawyers working on legal proceedings with people who have experienced violence. And the legal proceedings were for orders of protection and for custody. But the part that I wrote was the trauma pieces throughout that handbook. And there's all kinds of examples of how to have a conversation with someone where you're noticing signs of trauma, how to think about and discuss with them whether they should ask for an accommodation or not, discuss with them the signs of trauma that you're seeing and how that might come up in the court and what you could do to help them. So there's a lot of really good information in it, and it's a PDF you can get. I think, Jose Juan, are we going to post resources on our website?
Yes. Anything that's mentioned throughout the webinar we will share with the participants. Yes.
Okay. Because that was also an OVW-funded project, and I think we give that out to our courts folks that attend our courts training. Anyway, it's a PDF you can download, and it has a lot of tips. You can ignore the legal strategies sessions if those aren't relevant to you, but those tips of how to have these conversations, those apply across the board. It doesn't matter whether it's a legal situation or you're an advocate. It's just kind of non-judgmental, kind and gentle discussions with someone about trauma and how it might affect what they're trying to accomplish. So let's see, I know we're running out of time here. One other thing that I wanted to say is that if you can use experts in your court proceedings or bring experts to your community to educate, like your CCR or your staff, it's really helpful because it'll normalize victim behaviors. And that's really, really important, because when people start seeing the signs of trauma as normal, then they'll assess credibility better and they'll do a better job working with survivors. And then one thing that I've seen people do around the country is collaborating with mental health professionals. And this is a tricky one. So there are the ways in which mental health works that isn't so much empowerment-based, so you really want to be careful how you do these collaborations. A lot of times what people will do is just know who in their community works with people who've experienced trauma and then refer them. And then the survivor can, decide whether they want to or not. But anyway, I think that's helpful for folks. And if you want more information on that, you can email me and I'm happy to help you think that through. It's a little bit more complicated than we have time for. Okay, so I think I'll stop here. So on this last slide is you're going to have to repeat things often and just be okay with that. Try to keep things as simple as possible. Don't overwhelm someone with too much details. Like, just kind of break it down. Talk about the signs of trauma, signs and symptoms of trauma. And if you do this over and over again, the way that our brains work is eventually this is how the survivor will think about it, because we can rewire the brain. I love this. There's this great video online on YouTube about neuroplasticity that takes this really, really complex thing and explains it in like 3 minutes. And basically, if you do something the same way over and over again, that over time you can rewire your brain to do it that way. So if you work with someone over a period of time and you work with them in the same way each time, it'll get easier and easier for them to do it. It'll be the way that they do what you're working with them on. So if you're helping someone get ready for their testimony, that's the kind of thing that the neuroplasticity piece will kick in if you've done it with them over a period of time. Okay, Jose Juan, I think we're almost out of time. Is there any last question or comment?
No, if anyone has any last-minute questions, please. We have about 3 more minutes. But yeah, as mentioned throughout, all the PowerPoint and any of the materials that were mentioned here during the presentation or the webinar will be shared with the participants today. So just be on the lookout for those. Again, just a reminder, if folks are interested in the next 2 webinars of this 3-part series, please, you can visit our website at www.nationallatinonetwork.org, and you can register, as well as for any other upcoming webinars that Casa Esperanza will be hosting. Folks are just thanking you for sharing your story, Olga. As always, as I mentioned before, every time I listen to your story, I learn something new. And just your story of survivalhood is amazing, and thank you for that and willing to share your experience with the rest of the world. And if there's nothing else, I think we are done. And again, thank you to the participants who joined us. And as I mentioned before, all this information